He confessed to cheating with his boss. Months later, my quiet plan made millions. So last Tuesday, my husband told me he'd been sleeping with his boss. Yeah, just like that. No warning, no tears, no we need to talk. He said it while I was taking lasagna out of the oven. And the craziest part? He looked almost proud. For context, my name's Grace Holloway. I'm 38, I work at a small-town library in Vermont. And until last week, I honestly thought I was living a simple, happy life. We'd been married 17 years. 17. We owned a yellow house with white shutters, 2 golden retrievers, and a calendar full of church potlucks and neighborhood barbecues. You know, the kind of life that looks perfect on Facebook. Ethan, my husband, was a marketing manager at a mid-sized firm in Burlington. He wore nice suits, talked fast, and always thought of himself as the guy with potential. I used to think his ambition was charming. Turns out, it was just arrogance in a better suit. That Tuesday night, I'd made dinner like usual. Lasagna, garlic bread, and a bottle of red wine we'd been saving for something special. Guess that something special was the moment he decided to break my life in half. He walked in late, smelling like expensive perfume, not mine, and said, "Grace, I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else." Now, I'm not proud of what I did next, but I didn't react, not the way people expect. I didn't scream, throw the plate, or cry into my apron. I just looked at him. The way you'd look at a stranger trying to sell you insurance at your own door. He said, "It just happened, Grace. She's my boss. It's complicated." I remember setting the serving spoon down gently. "Complicated," I repeated. "Like taxes or like cheating on your wife of 17 years? He sighed, rubbed his temples, like I was the problem. "You've gotten boring, Grace. You never want to try new things. You never—" I cut him off. "Sleep with my employer?" He frowned. "That's not fair." And that's when I laughed. Not loud, not bitter, just one of those tired laughs that say, "Oh, honey, you have no idea who you're talking to." I took a bite of lasagna, nodded, and said, "It's a little dry tonight." He blinked at me, completely thrown off. I think he wanted me to explode. He wanted a scene. He wanted to be the victim in the story he'd already started writing in his head. The one where his wife was cold, and he fell into someone else's arms. But I didn't give him that. I gave him silence. And trust me, silence hurts a lot more when someone expects chaos. The rest of dinner was quiet, except for the sound of my fork scraping the plate. At one point, he muttered something about being honest and starting over. I just nodded and said, "You're right, honesty's important." I didn't tell him that I'd already seen the hotel receipts 2 weeks earlier, or that my gut had been whispering this truth long before his mouth ever did. After dinner, he went to shower. I sat at the table for a while, staring at the candle melting down. Funny how that little flame looked steadier than I felt. But even then, something in me shifted. It wasn't rage or heartbreak. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop begging for answers from someone who never deserved your questions. You see, Ethan always loved control. Even when we were dating, he'd make little comments about how I dressed, who I hung out with, how I should smile more. I mistook it for care, but really, it was a slow erosion of self-worth disguised as love. I guess that's how people like him operate. They chip away at you until you're small enough to fit their ego. So I made a decision that night. No crying, no begging. I'd let him believe he still had the upper hand, at least for now, because when men like Ethan think they've won, that's when they stop paying attention. And when they stop paying attention, that's when I strike. Before going to bed, I washed the dishes, poured the leftover wine down the sink, and looked out the window. Snow was falling softly over the yard, covering everything, even the mess he'd made of my life, in a calm, white silence. He came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and whispered, "We'll get through this, okay?" I didn't move. I just looked at our reflection in the window. He saw a woman who'd forgive him. I saw a woman who was already gone. I whispered back, "Sure, Ethan, we'll get through it." But in my head, I was already planning how I'd burn every bridge he thought I'd never cross. And that, my friend, was the Tuesday that broke me, or maybe the Tuesday that finally set me free. I remember the morning after like it was a file stamped in my head. Quiet, deliberate, and oddly businesslike. Instead of falling apart, I did what I'd always done when life handed me a jumble of problems. I made a list. I opened my laptop, named the document Project Quiet Dawn, and treated it like any other community grant proposal I'd written for the library. Clear goals, deadlines, and line items. It sounds almost clinical, and maybe that's how I protected myself, by turning a private wound into a spreadsheet I could manage. First step, inventory. I wrote down every account we shared, every credit card with my name on it, the mortgage paperwork, car loans, recurring subscriptions he'd signed me up for, because it's easier. I sat there and typed until my fingers cramped, and with every line I felt a little less like someone waiting to be rescued, and more like someone making sure she wouldn't be robbed blind. Then I called Mara, my older sister, a family lawyer who wears sensible shoes and the kind of no-nonsense blazer that screams, "I will read your deposition and make you cry." She'd warned me about Ethan when we were kids. She'd said then, "Watch how he talks about people. He reveals himself." I told her everything in a voice that was calm on the surface, but bristling underneath, the way you tell a surgeon where the hurt is and expect them to operate. Mara didn't gasp. She didn't ask me to forgive him or to stay. She asked for documents, account numbers, screenshots of receipts, hotel names, email headers. She sent me a checklist titled, "Before you say anything legally stupid," and I dutifully checked the boxes like a grown-up. It felt absurdly empowering, like putting on a jacket before stepping out into a storm. While Mara handled the legal scaffolding, I leaned on my real community. Cole, my old high school friend who owns the cafe on Main Street and knows everyone's dog's name, became my unofficial operations manager. He helped me set up a personal account I'd been too naive to open before, a secret savings file called Stash that I'd funded with small freelance editing gigs and tips from the library's summer reading program. Cole brewed me coffee stronger than my will and let me camp out at the corner table while I sorted financial statements. And every time a stranger at the counter complimented my library vibe, it felt like a small stitch mending me. Having someone who laughed in the right places, who said, "You're not alone, Grace," instead of offering that tired, "You'll get over it," made a world of difference. There were practical moves I'd never imagined making at 38. I called the bank at 2 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come and argued with a customer rep until they removed Ethan's supplementary cards. It felt petty and righteous. I set up two-factor authentication on every shared account and changed email passwords that he'd been too busy to remember. I downloaded our text history, saved photos from his phone when he left it logged into the television, and sorted conversations by date and tone. I printed out hotel receipts and credit card alerts and highlighted lines like a detective marking clues. Each highlighted line wasn't just evidence. It was a tiny reclamation of memory, proof that my suspicion had been right when others told me I was being paranoid. A small, almost goofy detail. I found an old yearbook in the attic, the one from senior year with everybody's dumb signatures and heartfelt notes. And there, in Ethan's handwriting, was a scribble. "Grace, don't ever stop being nice." I circled it with a red pen and slid it into a folder labeled Reminders. That file ended up on the same shelf as receipts and printed emails. Later, when I had to testify to how I'd been gaslit over the years, that tiny faded note felt like the last honest thing he'd once thought. It's a small Americana moment, yearbooks, high school football memories, that grounded me in who I'd been before marriage, and crucially, who I could still be. I also did things that felt wildly practical and small-town American. I rekeyed the front door at 3 a.m, Cole did the honors, because boundaries start with locks. I swapped out the golf clubs he loved and donated them under the cover of night to the high school team, with a note, "For kids who need a sport, not an ego." I booked 3 initial consultations with divorce attorneys, one female, one male, and one who specialized in protecting women's assets. Because I wanted options, not sympathy. I signed up for an evening accounting course at the community college because I hated the idea of feeling financially illiterate. I signed up partly because the professor's name was Dr. Patel, and he made spreadsheets sound like poetry. I bookmarked small business permit pages because somewhere in the back of my head, a tiny brave idea had started to bloom, offering neighborhood story hours and a small book curation service that could bring in cash. I wasn't building a mansion, just a reliable, practical life that wouldn't wobble if someone decided to walk out of it. Emotionally, it was a weird blend. Some hours I felt furious enough to invent crimes. Other hours I sat in the living room and laughed at old sitcom reruns until my ribs hurt because my jaw needed the exercise. There were moments of deep grief, memories of church suppers and Sunday drives that now felt like props in someone else's play, followed by sharp judgments. Why had I ignored the little uncanny moments? Why did I let compliments from strangers matter more than my own quiet truths? Instead of staying in regret, I turned those questions into plans. For everything he'd erased, I planted 2 new routines: a morning run to clear my head, a weekly meeting with the library volunteers to prepare a mobile literacy outreach for kids who can't get to us. The work kept me anchored, the people kept me human. And then something small and deliciously mundane happened that felt like an omen. An anonymous email from a junior analyst at Ethan's firm saying, "You should see what I found when I reconciled expense reports." The message included a few scanned pages with line items for client entertainment and a restaurant in Miami that didn't match any project dates. I could have burned with righteous anger, but instead I forwarded it to Mara and to myself, and smiled like a cat who knows where the cream is hidden. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about facts lining up with intuition. It was the universe handing me a paper trail I could use. By the end of those first sleepless days, Project Quiet Dawn had a timeline: secure finances, gather evidence, consult lawyers, and quietly rebuild any part of life Ethan thought he owned. I taped the checklist to my fridge next to a postcard from my grandmother. "Remember who you are," she wrote in looping blue ink. And every time I opened the fridge to get milk, I felt like I was walking closer to the version of myself who refused to disappear. I wasn't plotting melodramatic revenge shows. I was making a way forward, polite and relentless. That, in its own very American way, felt both like standing my ground and starting a small revolution. The next morning felt like the world had turned down its volume. The air was still, the kind of quiet you get right before a snowstorm. I stood there, barefoot in the kitchen, staring at the same counter where he'd told me about the affair just hours earlier. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I made coffee. The kind that fills the house with that nutty, roasted smell. The kind he used to say he loved. I didn't make him a cup this time. I just stood there, sipping mine, feeling the warmth hit my throat like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Something inside me shifted that morning. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was more like a quiet switch flipping, the moment you stop waiting for an apology that will never come. I grabbed my notebook, opened a new page, and wrote on the top in capital letters, "Project Quiet Dawn." I didn't even know what it meant yet, but it sounded like what I needed. The start of something calm, deliberate, unstoppable. Step 1 was simple: stop being predictable. Ethan was the kind of man who thrived on control. He liked to think he could read me like a weather report, calm skies, no surprises. I was done being his forecast, so I played my part. That morning, when he wandered into the kitchen looking guilty but smug, I greeted him with a neutral, "Morning." You could see the confusion in his eyes. He expected me to fall apart, but I was already rebuilding, quietly, right in front of him. After he left for work, I drove to the bank. I remember the smell, that sterile, faintly lemon scent that all banks seem to share. The teller was a woman named Denise, about my age, with a kindness that looked like it had survived a few rough divorces. I told her I needed to separate accounts. She didn't ask questions, just nodded like she'd seen this scene 1,000 times. "Honey," she said softly, sliding the papers toward me, "make sure you keep your receipts. Men get amnesia when money's involved." I smiled for the first time in days. Then I called my sister Mara, the kind of lawyer who scares people without raising her voice. She answered with, "Tell me you're finally done with that man." I didn't say yes, not yet. I just told her I was preparing. She said, "Good, that means you're getting smart." That night, she sent me a document titled 10 Things to Do Before You Say Divorce Out Loud. I printed it, folded it in half, and slid it into my purse like a secret weapon. The next stop was Cole's Cafe. Cole and I go way back. High school friends who somehow stayed close despite life's chaos. He's the kind of guy who gives free muffins to old ladies and sarcastic advice to everyone else. I sat at the corner booth, nursing a latte, trying not to look like a woman whose life was falling apart. Cole looked at me for 5 seconds before saying, "So who do I punch?" I laughed. God, it felt good to laugh. I told him everything. He listened, no interruptions, no pity, just leaned back and said, "Grace, if he thinks he broke you, he's about to learn the difference between quiet and weak." That night, I started digging. Every receipt, every text, every business trip he'd mentioned, I pulled it all together. My desk looked like a crime scene from a Lifetime movie. He had no idea how organized I could be when I was hurt. I found hotel bookings charged under client meetings and dinner reservations for two at places we could never afford when we were married happily. I didn't confront him, not yet. I just saved everything. I labeled a folder evidence and tucked it in the drawer beside my tax records. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was protection, my insurance policy for when he decided to twist the story. In between all the chaos, I caught myself remembering the early days. The time he brought me sunflowers from the farmer's market because he said roses were too obvious. I used to love that about him, how he noticed small things. But somewhere along the line, he stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as furniture. Reliable, unchanging, background. That realization hurt worse than the cheating itself. So I changed the scenery, I rearranged the living room, moved the couch, swapped out the curtains he hated. I even repainted one wall a soft green, the color he said didn't match the vibe. Every stroke of paint felt like erasing him, one layer at a time. And then out of nowhere, I got an email from someone at his office. A junior analyst, new kid, probably nervous as hell. He wrote, "I don't know you, but I thought you should see this." Attached was a report. Company expenses showing Ethan and Laura billing client dinners at a beach resort. Miami, midweek. He wasn't even creative with his lies. I didn't reply to the email. I just saved it under Project Quiet Dawn and smiled. It wasn't anger anymore. It was satisfaction. That slow, cold kind that doesn't need an audience. That night, Ethan came home late again. He kissed my cheek like nothing had changed, like he still owned my peace. I looked at him, really looked, and thought, "You poor fool, you have no idea who you just created." I went upstairs, brushed my teeth, and slept like a woman with a plan. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't loud or cruel, it's quiet. It's methodical. It's a woman like me, sipping coffee in silence, smiling at the thought of a storm that's already on its way. When the dust finally settled, the world didn't explode. It just went quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a thunderstorm when everything still smells like rain, but you know something big has changed. Ethan was out of the house by then. The company asked him to resign after the HR investigation wrapped up, which was corporate speak for, "We caught your dumbass." Laura got fired too. Apparently, the higher-ups didn't find client dinners in Miami particularly ethical when you're supposed to be married. The best part? I didn't even have to lift a finger. The truth did the heavy lifting for me. When his box of office junk arrived, a photo frame, a tie clip, and that stupid mug that said "World's Best Manager," I didn't feel joy, just a weird calm, like watching the final credits roll on a movie I never wanted to star in. He tried calling, of course. Left messages like, "Grace, we can work through this," and "You're being emotional, don't throw everything away." Emotional, that word always made me laugh. It's what men say when they've run out of excuses but still want to sound like they're in control. I didn't block his number right away, though. I wanted to hear how desperation sounds when the ego cracks. A week later, he showed up at the library. Yeah, the public library, the place he used to call your little hobby job. He looked smaller somehow, standing between the shelves of paperbacks and fluorescent lights. I remember the exact book I was shelving when I saw him. The Road Less Traveled. Couldn't have scripted it better. He started with his usual fake sincere tone. "Grace, I made mistakes, but I've changed." I turned to him, calm as ever, and said, "Ethan, people don't change that fast, especially people who practice lying for years." He frowned, looked around like the books might defend him. "You don't have to be cruel," he said. I smiled. "Oh, sweetheart, this isn't cruelty, it's closure." After that, I didn't see him again. Mara finalized the divorce papers. I kept the house, mostly because he couldn't afford the buyout. Not because I wanted to stay in a memory. But I did something unexpected. Instead of selling the place, I turned the front porch into a little free library for kids. Painted it bright yellow, stocked it with donated books, and called it the Holloway Corner. The irony wasn't lost on me. The neighbors loved it. Parents stopped by after school, kids picked up books, and sometimes people left notes. "Thank you for doing this," or "This made my kids smile." I'd read them at night, a mug of chamomile tea in hand, and think, maybe this is what healing actually looks like. Cole, remember him, the cafe guy? Kept showing up too. He'd bring fresh muffins for the librarians, but always ended up leaving them on my desk. We never talked about Ethan much. Once, when a particularly nosy patron whispered about my divorce drama, Cole just looked her dead in the eye and said, "She didn't lose a husband, she lost a parasite." I nearly spit out my coffee. That's when I realized laughter was my new favorite form of revenge. Some nights, I'd sit on the back porch, the dogs curled at my feet, listening to the hum of summer crickets and thinking about how different my life looked now. A year ago, I was planning vacation itineraries and worrying about Ethan's moods. Now I was planning literacy drives for underprivileged kids and learning how to file taxes like a pro. I even took a leap, applied for the regional library director position that had opened up. I almost didn't apply, telling myself I wasn't experienced enough. Then I remembered how Ethan used to say I wasn't ambitious enough, so I hit send. 3 weeks later, I got the job. Turns out they'd been looking for someone quietly effective. Guess that's me in a nutshell. The first time I stood in that new office, big windows, a view of the mountains, a plaque with my name, I thought about how funny life is. You spend years trying to keep someone else's world from falling apart, and the moment you let it, yours finally starts to build itself. I didn't feel vindictive, I just felt right, whole, like I'd finally stepped back into the skin I'd abandoned years ago. Ethan emailed once more after that. Subject line, "I'm sorry, the body was just a few lines." The usual guilt cocktail, regret, nostalgia, maybe a dash of self-pity. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to myself under a new folder titled Reminders. Because sometimes you need proof of how far you've come. The library thrived. Kids started reading more, volunteers doubled, and the mayor even showed up one day to shake my hand. There was this local newspaper piece titled, "From Betrayal to Bookshelves, How One Woman Rebuilt." I laughed when I read it, but it felt good. I didn't rebuild to prove Ethan wrong. I rebuilt because somewhere between the chaos and the quiet, I realized I never needed anyone's permission to stand tall. So yeah, when people ask me if I miss him, I say no. What I miss is the version of myself who believed love meant shrinking so someone else could shine. That version is gone now, and thank God for that. These days, when I lock up the library after dark, the air smells like old paper and possibility. Sometimes I whisper a little thank you, not to Ethan, but to the Tuesday that broke me, because without it, I might never have learned that peace doesn't come from holding on. It comes from finally, mercifully, letting go. It's been 6 months since the divorce was finalized, and some mornings I still wake up expecting to hear the sound of Ethan's alarm blaring through the house. That awful digital beep that used to drive me crazy. But now the only sound is the soft purr of my cat Clover and the coffee maker sputtering like it's trying its best to keep up. Funny how quiet can feel like freedom when you used to mistake it for loneliness. A few weeks ago, I decided to share my story online. Not because I wanted sympathy, but because I wanted to let it go somewhere other than my chest. I posted it on Reddit. Off my chest, of all places. I called it The Tuesday That Broke Me. I thought maybe 10 strangers would read it, maybe one would leave a kind comment. Instead, it exploded. People from all over the country messaged me, women, men, even a few teenagers, saying my story reminded them that peace doesn't always mean forgiveness, that sometimes peace means finally saying enough. It was overwhelming in the best way. Someone even wrote, "You turned betrayal into a blueprint for strength." I don't think I've ever cried so hard over a sentence written by a stranger. Since then, life's been simple, but not small. The Holloway Corner Library grew into something bigger than I ever expected. The town council approved funding to expand it into a mobile book van that'll travel to rural schools. Cole volunteered to paint it, bright yellow, of course, with the words "Stories belong to everyone" on the side. Sometimes he catches me staring at the van, smiling to myself, and says, "What? You look like you just robbed a bank and got away with it." And maybe in some way, I did. I stole my life back. Last month, the local radio station invited me for an interview about the project. I almost said no. Public speaking still terrifies me. But something in me whispered, "This is what rising looks like." So I went. Sitting in that tiny studio with the smell of old coffee and microphones that had seen better days, I told them about Project Quiet Dawn, about how it started as a survival plan and turned into a map back to myself. When the host asked what I'd say to someone standing where I once stood, I paused, thought about it, and said, "Stop waiting for someone else to do right by you. Start doing right by yourself. You can't control who hurts you, but you can decide who heals you." The host teared up. I think I did too. Sometimes, when the sun sets behind the hills and the light hits just right through the window, I catch my reflection in the glass and barely recognize the woman staring back. She's calmer, stronger, maybe even a little wiser. I still have scars, emotional ones that tug when the weather changes, but they're mine now. I don't hide them. They remind me of the day I stopped breaking for someone else's comfort. Ethan tried reaching out once more, sent a Christmas card with nothing but "Hope you're well" written inside. I didn't respond. I didn't burn it either. I just tucked it in the back of my drawer, not as a keepsake, but as evidence. Proof that I survived something that once convinced me I couldn't. There's no anger left, no satisfaction in his downfall. Just a quiet certainty that I don't need closure from someone who was never open to begin with. Last Sunday, I was walking through the park with Cole and Clover in her ridiculous little carrier backpack. Yes, I've become that person. When we passed a couple arguing near the fountain, the woman looked exhausted, the kind of tired that seeps into your bones. For a second, our eyes met. I gave her a small, knowing smile. She smiled back, like we'd just exchanged a secret handshake. Only women who've been through hell would understand. That moment stuck with me. Not because it was sad, but because it was beautiful. It reminded me how pain, when you survive it, becomes a kind of quiet language. That night, I wrote one last line in my journal. He killed our marriage that Tuesday night, but that was also the night I came back to life. And I meant every word. I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful, not for what he did, but for what it forced me to become. Now, every morning, I drink my coffee out of a chipped mug that says "World's Okayest Librarian." A joke gift from Cole, and I laugh. Because okay feels perfect. Peace doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits with you in your kitchen at 6:45 a.m., purring softly, tasting like coffee and freedom. And if you asked me today what I've learned from all of it, I'd tell you this. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's living so well they stop being relevant. Looking back, I think the real lesson wasn't about betrayal or revenge. It was about rediscovery. I used to think strength meant holding everything together, keeping the peace, smiling through the cracks. But sometimes strength means letting it all fall apart, standing in the wreckage, and deciding what's worth rebuilding. Life has this strange way of breaking you exactly where you've been pretending to be unbreakable. And once the noise fades, you finally hear your own voice, the one you've been silencing to make others comfortable. That's what happened to me. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, and started forgiving myself for ignoring the red flags waving right in front of me. I've learned that self-respect is quiet, but it's powerful. You don't have to yell to take your life back. Sometimes you just have to stop explaining. People show you who they are. Believe them the first time. And when they do, don't let bitterness grow where peace is meant to live. As my grandma used to say, what goes around comes around. I guess the real justice isn't watching someone fall. It's rising so high their shadow can't reach you anymore. If you've ever been where I was, tired, unseen, holding on to something that's already gone, I hope my story reminds you that it's never too late to start over. You're not broken. You're becoming. So what about you? Have you ever found freedom on the other side of heartbreak? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this one hit home, give it a like and subscribe for more stories about resilience, redemption, and real human strength. Until next time, I hope you find your own quiet dawn, that moment when the storm clears and peace finally feels like home again.